So I guess that most of you know that I'm the head of the museum's archives, library and rare books collections, as well as more recently the world collections. So I'm not biased when I tell you that our archives and library are really special. The Australian Museum holds the largest and oldest natural history library and archive in Australia. We're really lucky, not just that the archives is so large and intact, but especially that it is still kept and looked after in the place where it was made. It makes it one of the best collections in Australia, not just for taxonomic work and cultural research, but for thinking about the establishment and growth of European natural science and scientific cultures in Australia from the colonial era onwards. Central to that is the history of the museum's library. For the 19th century colonial museum in isolated New South Wales, growing the library and establishing an independent knowledge base at the museum was as important and urgent a priority as growing the collection itself. You can see this in the museum's account ledgers and in the long book lists published in the early annual reports. These show that until at least the 1890s, buying books, which were expensive and mostly had to be imported from London, kept pace with specimen purchases. For a museum just beginning scientific work in natural history, access to a library was essential for cross-referencing and making comparative observations and fitting newly discovered animals into classification schemes. Without its own library to work from, access to current knowledge was dependent on the patronage and generosity of the colonial colonies' gentlemen scientists, especially the Macleay family, who held the colony's largest scientific library. To build its scientific authority, the museum needed a library of its own. A lot of our 19th century published material is now available via digitised copies online through things like VHL, and part of the library is now held off-site. But you can still come to the library on level 3 and see from the sheer size of the collection and its well-used condition how essential it has been to museum research and the museum's scientific identity. Tracing the development of the library collection and thinking about how central it was to collection work and taxonomic classification in the pre-digital era also makes the library a great resource for thinking about museum knowledge and research priorities and how they've changed over time. Which is to say that I probably spend an unusual and unhealthy amount of time thinking about books and libraries. And not just how to run them, but also what's in them and why, who uses them and how access to library knowledge is managed and sometimes traded and restricted, and how they come together as a collection and how that's changed over time. Which means I think about reading, writing and publishing too, since traditionally at least, that's what books and libraries were all about. Of course, reading and writing are usually very personal, private acts, and that means it's very difficult to write their histories. But studying the collection and use of personal libraries and book collections can help. In the Australian colonial context, it can be a way to think about the interactions between an individual's experiences of the Australian environment, nature and landscapes, and the First Nations people who already lived here, and the European frames of knowledge and thinking the colonists brought with them. Big institutional collections like the Australian museums tell us one story about how scientific knowledge is made and perpetuated. But natural history expeditions, fieldwork and collecting is one of the places where encounters between knowledge makers, knowledge systems and the individual is most obvious, and where it is often described and transcribed both as a personal experience and as a scientific collecting event. Which takes me to a very different book collection held within Germany's National Library, the National Library in Berlin. So I'm just going to share, am I doing that? I'm going to share my screen with you now. I can't see. Okay, so I think he's on your left is Gerard Krefft, and on your right is Wilhelm Blandowski. This time last year I was in Berlin as a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute. Along with getting time to work on my never-ending PhD, part of what I was doing there was following the paper trail of Australian Museum curator Gerard Krefft, who was born in northern Germany in the 1830s and retained strong German links throughout his Australian career. Whilst I was there researching Krefft's early career and the Australian Museum's German networks, I came across a very unusual book collection, which brings together libraries, reading, writing and fieldwork and the Australian Museum in some surprising and interesting ways. Gerard Krefft had a modest family background in trade and arrived in Melbourne during the gold rush with an ambition to make some money and become a naturalist. Firstly, as a natural history illustrator. His big break and his education as a museum naturalist came when he joined an 1856 natural history collecting expedition to the Murray River, led by his compatriot Wilhelm Blandowski and funded by the National Museum in Melbourne. The remains of the 12,000 specimens they collected, along with their lists and catalogues, are still held at Museum Victoria. But in the Natural History Museum in Berlin are many of the drawings from the expedition, mostly drawn by Krefft himself. There's about 150 of these. In Berlin's Ethnographic Museum, there are 15 cultural objects the men collected alongside natural history. And at the State Library is the remains of the very unusual field library that Blandowski is said to have taken on the expedition. There's no list of the actual contents of the library they took, but from Krefft's expedition account, we know its weight, 600 weight or 300 kilograms. That weight includes writing materials, maps and blotting paper, but even on my very rough calculations, and presuming that Krefft might have been exaggerating a little, the library might have contained anything from 150 to over 300 books. It's an astonishing load. There's a long tradition of libraries being part of maritime expeditions, where a library would be part of the ship naturalist equipment, but for obvious reasons of weight and space, beyond basic maps and field guides, an extensive library is almost unheard of on a land-based travelling expedition, especially since the expedition consisted of only one cart, pulled by some very stubborn bullocks. The single horse was ridden by Blandowski. The other 3 members of the expedition had to walk the 500 kilometres from Melbourne to the Murray River, which took 4 months, where the expedition set up camp and remained for the next 6 months. As you can imagine, Blandowski's heavy library was a source of immediate and continuing tension. It became the focus for Krefft's bitter complaints about Blandowski's logistical failures, his superiority, his selfishness, and his woeful leadership skills. This is how Krefft described the expeditions. Of books, we had a large supply, from Walker's Dictionary to pamphlets by Spurzheim and Spinoza. Every book bearing on the Australian fauna was there, including all the exploring expeditions from Sturt to Leichhardt. In fact, we carried about 600 weight of books and writing materials, half a gallon of ink and a useless photographic apparatus, including chemicals which would never work. In consequence of this ridiculous outfit, the men were allowed nothing more than 30 pounds of luggage and myself 5 pounds more for drawing materials. I leave any man to decide if 2 shirts of clothing and 2 pair of good blankets would not weigh 30 pounds, and if it is the customary rule in forming exploring parties to supply only the wants of the commander and let the men shift as best they can with nothing more or less than 30 pounds of luggage. I have to agree with Krefft. It seems at least a very lopsided load. The remains of the collection in Berlin is entirely English language. Presumably, his family kept the German language books. When it was donated to the Royal Library by Blandowski's sister in the 1880s, it consisted of almost 200 volumes. But German libraries have their own difficult histories, and World War II bombing destroyed some of their collections. It looks like only around 53 of Blandowski's Australian library have survived and are still held there. So it's nothing like the entire travelling library, and neither it is a complete picture of Blandowski's reading history, education, or the scope of the knowledge he brought with him and used in his fieldwork. But it's worn and well used, and it does provide some tantalising if incomplete clues. Here it is on a trolley at the State Library, The ledger at the top is the original listing, and on the right is a dedication that's in one of the volumes. Most importantly, it's a very Germanic library, reflecting Blandowski's social class. He was minor Prussian nobility and an early career in mining, but also a wide cultural education and a much broader background in arts and literature than might be expected from a British-trained naturalist of the same generation. Alongside the expected almanacs, atlases, expedition accounts and natural history texts, it contains works of philosophy, poetry and literature, essays on politics and culture, even novels and Shakespeare. It includes works by both pillars of the German Romantic imagination, Goethe and Humboldt, and reflects the German concept of Wissenschaft, where knowledge is a process discoverable in systematic research of all kinds, so including philosophy and history as well as natural history, rather than a set of facts. German-speaking ideas about natural knowledge and how to describe it were larger and more inclusive for much longer than their British scientific contemporaries. On the expedition, the men did not just concentrate on natural history collecting, as they had been instructed, but were interested in the country they travelled through as geology and landscape, and as it was lived in and known by the Indigenous people they met and collected with along the way. Around 1/3 of the books are other Australian journeys of exploration and discovery, which were the common narrative result of these sorts of journeys and found an avid readership back in Britain. So Blandowski and Krefft had a good idea of the frames of reference and how English-speaking writers had organised and written about experiences of travel and encounter. They perhaps even had some understanding of the repeated failures of these expeditions to adapt their ideals of heroic scientific behaviour to the Australian nation's and knowledges. Oh, sorry. This is my very, very basic list of the high-level subjects of the collection that's left in Berlin. Certainly, the pictorial account of Indigenous life and customs that Blandowski made after the expedition, which reuses many of Krefft's illustrations, is nothing like any of these earlier accounts. It's a fascinating insight into Blandowski's response to his experience of Australia, and also one of the 19th century's most fascinating European accounts of Indigenous life and practice. This is one of the illustrations from Blandowski's book, and you can see Blandowski bartering for specimens with the local people, and that's Krefft almost falling out of the frame, looking very exhausted on the side. And I'm not going to talk anymore about this book, but it's a really amazing and super interesting volume, and we've got a copy of the facsimile in the Australian Museum Library if you're interested. This was published as the frontispiece for the book, and it really represents how inclusive Blandowski's idea of natural knowledge was. Krefft too made detailed notes on Indigenous customs and practice on their journey and their knowledge of the animals they collected together, including local names and stories. Both men were as interested in studying ways of life and living as they were in the objects of natural history they had been instructed to collect. Along the route to the Murray River, the men saw frequent reminders that this was still Aboriginal land, actively cared for and occupied. Settlement, however, was expanding rapidly, and the landscape and animal life was changing fast. And although he was entirely self-taught and was hired for his practical skills in hunting, collecting, taxidermy and preparation, Krefft was never just in collecting for collecting's sake or in remaining an artisan field collector. He had begun his natural history education studying at the new public library in Victoria, and now he wanted to understand and study animals in their environments. In 6 months on the banks of the Murray, he collected and traded thousands of animals, reptiles, snakes, small and large mammals, birds, insects, shells and fish. Each dead animal was tagged and listed before it was dropped into a vat of alcohol or prepared with basic field taxidermy techniques. Consolidated monthly lists and specimens were sent by steamer to Melbourne. A detailed catalogue was prepared too, with descriptive entries for each species, often including detailed cultural notes. And here's a perhaps somewhat idealised his book, the camp as it was set up. You can see that the Neri people were camped right alongside them, and that it looks somewhat like pastoral, in fact. When Blandowski left the camp to travel solo further along the Murray, Krefft even set up his own experimental riverside zoo that he called a Regent's Park in miniature. Here he kept animals, mostly small mammals, in cages to observe their behaviour and so that he could get more lifelike drawings and fuller descriptions of their habits as living creatures. For the time, it's a highly unusual approach. The idea of field stations and systematic observing and studying animal behaviour in their own environments did not really take hold until much later in the 19th century. The library gives us some general clues to this expansive view of the expedition's natural history goals and practice, but unfortunately Blandowski's field diaries are lost, so it's impossible to know what he actually read, and it's doubly difficult to know how much Krefft read or used the library. At the very least, he would have used the books for their natural history illustrations, techniques and reference, for technical advice, cataloguing and fact-checking, and for help with animal classifications. We know too that Blandowski read for pleasure, particularly in the evenings. Or rather, in Krefft's telling, after the day's real work of specimen collection and description was done, he had to still to spend the hours after dark as Blandowski's amanuensis in the drudgery of transferring to paper the description and observations which had accumulated during the day in my commander's brain. Now the heart of the heat of the tent makes me perspire. The insects are buzzing about, and to withdraw my commander's attention, I make an awkward attempt to catch a moth, till I get wearied with everything and try to raise a dispute about some quotation of Shakespeare. Out comes Big Walker and all the rest of the books, and at last I am released, and after selecting a clean piece of ground without any burrs, I drop down and go to sleep. In this case, the books provided sufficient distraction to allow Krefft to leave Blandowski, who himself slept on a comfortable mattress in the cart, and find a quiet place for his exhausted night's sleep. Wiley Krefft was as able to learn from experience and observing the humans around him as he was from the books that clueless Blandowski relied on for guidance and amusement. Krefft, in fact, was much more successful than Blandowski in turning his expedition experience into a museum career. Blandowski's presentation of the results of the expedition to its Melbourne sponsors in late 1857 was a complete disaster, when it appeared that he had named some of the ugliest fish specimens after the most easily offended of his sponsors. He returned to Europe 2 years later and ended his career not but as a portrait photographer. It's clear that Krefft's ideas about scientific knowledge and how to attain it, through philosophical discovery, practical experimentation and observation, as well as classification and taxonomic ordering, were learnt on the Blandowski expedition. And this expansive view of the role and practice of natural science was the one he brought with him to the Australian Museum when he was hired as assistant curator only a year later. It's evident in Krefft's approach to his first major curatorial project, too, that involved keeping live snakes in the basement of the museum and some nasty experiments with the effects of snake venom on other animals. His freewheeling experimental view of natural history put him into immediate and long-lasting conflict with the bug and beetle collectors who made up most of the museum's powerful board of trustees. Krefft was certainly cantankerous and difficult, but the conflict he stepped into at the museum was also a more fundamental opposition in views about mission and purpose. Evolutionary debates crystallised this difference in thinking in the 1870s, but it had its beginnings in Krefft's field education and the cultures and practice of natural science he learnt from Blandowski and his travelling library. So Blandowski's library is not just important for its contents and their possible uses on the expedition and after, but it's also a literal demonstration of how knowledge travels and of the links between local, national and international scientific regimes and communities of practice and knowledge. And our own museum library is the same. Like the expedition library, it's both a practical resource and itself a symbolic object and a collection item worth studying in its own right. Its contents are in daily use supporting museum and external science and cultural research, but investigations of its potential as a subject for history have barely begun. If we want to trace the history of what we are now, then the library's collection is one of the best resources we have for thinking about how the museum's mission, form, focus and functions were established and changed over time. The library brings together books and the world. It sits at the juncture of print culture, European scientific knowledge, the experience of Australian landscapes and nature, and Indigenous knowledge systems and cultures. The same mix that has produced the museum's own scientific knowledge and its identity as a uniquely Australian museum. Thank you.